leagues, parties, associations, institutions, councils. They give them all sorts of different names. And they're formed for a wide variety of purposes. The word church just happens to denote a coming together of people that have shared views about questions of religion, not just about God's. And we do share a common view about that, but also about right and wrong and leading a good and happy lives, leading lives worth living. We happen to believe that the supernatural is a human invention, that such ideas grow out of human hopes and fears, and that facts and reasons offer a better way of thinking about and coming to grips with these concerns, as with every problem that we confront or consider. Like the question of the meaning of life, so we'll come to that in a moment. Our approach is to do without authority, tradition, and established belief, which is to say without supernaturalism and without superstition. We all believe in things, you have to believe in things, but we hold that we should believe in things with good reason, things that are rooted in facts and reason, not because we're told we must believe things on faith. We hold that the how and why of beliefs is connected to morality because facts and reason have that connection. Good morning, Darryl. Glad you could make it.
Oh, yeah.
So facts and reason have a connection to morality, and knowingly rejecting facts and reasons is morally wrong. So that's our point of view. By the way, the Earth was at perihelion yesterday at 4:49 p.m. If you had a little feeling at that time, maybe at that moment, we were 91.4 million miles away from the sun. This coming July 4th, we'll be 94.5 million miles from the sun. Usually we say the Earth is 93 million miles away from the sun. That's an astronomical unit, but that's an average figure because we actually follow an elliptical path around the sun. Also, on this day in 1521, the Pope excommunicated Martin Luther. And on this date in 1962, the Pope excommunicated, a different Pope, excommunicated Fidel Castro. Fun facts. Here's our creed. If you don't like it, help us make a better one, and you can do that through our website. Help us ignite the forum that is there, and join us at Freethought Salon that we do on Sundays that are not the first Sunday of the month. There's information about that in the book. We expect to be meeting here at this location for the rest of the year. Next month it seems right after talking about the meaning of life today, and with Valentine's Day coming up in February, that we'll talk about the meaning of love. Love gets a lot of lip service, but we seem to hear about too many things happening in the world that don't sound very loving. Why is that, and what can be done about it? So we'll try to get into that next time. Please check out our website at churchoffreethought.org. Many of you have already been there, or you found us that way. Rusty, where's Rusty?
He's in the kid. He's with the
Yeah,
kid.
is Derek over there, by the way? No, didn't show him. Oh, wow. That's something else that we'll have to be talking about is Brenda Iwagwu, who usually does the child care Sunday service, couldn't make it today, but we need more than one people because we have little free thinkers, and they need to be shown how great free thought is too, and they have their own set of problems. You can imagine being a little atheist kid at school and what kind of challenges you face, and they need the help too. We can't let them all get to be our age before they figure things out and get some guidance. Plus which they learn that it's normal to be a free thinker and good to be a free thinker. So anyways, Rusty's posted a whole lot of material that used to be on our own website. There's a lot of stuff there now, including all the bulletins going back to 2008. There's a forum under the services section where you can post your ideas. You can sign up and get approved. We just don't let anybody in there. Go to our Facebook page and like and comment there. Joshua and I try to put something up every few days, something we come across. And you can also subscribe to our Twitter feed. Now we're planning an organizational meeting next month. We'd like to create more structure for our church and help ensure that it will be around for another 22 years, if not longer. There are more and better things that we could do, but we are the ones who have to see to that. Will is going to talk about that also before we conclude today. The Freethought Book Club is still planned for February 20th, and the book of Daniel Dennett's Breaking the Spell, Religion as a Natural Phenomenon. Daryl, who's principal in that, found a place to get it online for free, which is given on in our bulletin, so you can download that book for free. We're also hoping to have our Communitas, a periodic dinner event, to get together and learn more about each other and share our good news of the salvation of free thought. So up next is John Goche, who's going to supply us with prognostications for 2016. sure to be more reliable than reading entrails or hearing what God told Pat Robertson. And Scott already showed your first slide, but here's a little forward button to go forward. If you want to go back, you can do that. John, thank you so much for putting this together, something interesting for us.
I'm filling in your moment of science and be a little bit.
Moment of science, that's correct.
Much has been made of the fact by many people that this coincidence that we have here is for almost perfect alignment and between the moon, sun, and the earth at very precise distances to produce this awesome effect, right, must have been the consequence of some design by somebody just for our viewing view. But when you really start to dig down and look at the mechanics and the geometry of this, you realize that, well, maybe it's not quite as much of a coincidence at all. Now, a perfect solar eclipse would be one where, and it occurs to me that you've known a version of my songs. That's okay, it's probably current enough. I did update it a little bit. Is that too loud?
That's good.
All right. So a perfect solar eclipse would be one where the moon is positioned on a center line between the Earth and the Sun, exactly, and just barely cover up all of the points on the Sun's surface as viewed by an observer on the Earth. Now, if you look at the comparison between the distances and diameters of the bodies here, the moon is about 2,160 miles in diameter. The Sun is 865,000 miles in diameter. And the average distance between the Earth and the Moon is 238,600 miles. The average distance, and you kind of stole some of my thunder here, with the previous slide, is between the Earth and the Sun is 93 billion miles. So if you look at the ratios here, between these is, and one of the slides that I'm missing here is the one that shows the similar triangles and the geometry involved. But the bottom line is the way to get that perfect solar eclipse is these ratios have to be the same between the diameters and the distances. So if you take the right ratio of the diameters, you get 400.46, the diameter of the Sun over the diameter of the Moon. If you take the ratio of the distances, you got 93 million miles over 238,600 miles, you come out to 389.77. Now, those aren't exactly the same, are they? Right? They vary by about 3%. So already you can tell this arrangement that we have really isn't quite perfect. Not only that, but these distances are averages. If you look at the orbit of the Moon, the orbit of the Moon is an ellipse. So there's a closest approach called the perigee, which is at 225,300 miles. And at apogee, at the furthest distance, you're at 251,900 miles. Not only is this orbit misshapen, but it's also not perfectly aligned with the plane of the Earth's orbit around the Sun. It's inclined about 5 degrees to that plane. So the net effect is that on an average, a solar eclipse occurs somewhere on the Earth only once out of about every 18 months. Well, since the length of the duration of the Moon's orbit is designed to be once per month, right, by the calendar, design of the calendar, you can infer, well, out of about 18 attempts, we only get one hit, right? So it's not exactly a very perfect arrangement, is it, right? You miss most of the time. Now, the distance between the Moon and the Earth, of course, as I pointed out, varies over time. And if you look at the apparent angular diameter that the Moon and the Sun have, as viewed by an observer of the Earth, this shows you some of the variation. Now, the Earth's orbit is a very nearly circular orbit. So between the minimum and the maximum distances, you can see the apparent angular diameter of the Sun doesn't change very much. It's much more pronounced for the Moon, and this is, I designed this slide so that it actually represents a very close approximation of the relative change in the angular diameter. So you can see there's a lot of variation in the apparent angular diameter of the Moon. So if you combine the extremes, you see what happens for eclipses. At one end of the scale, when the Moon is farthest from the Earth and the Earth is closest to the Sun, you get an annular eclipse where not all the points on the Sun's surface are blocked by the Moon. At the other extreme, you get your total solar eclipse, when the moon is closest to the Earth and the Earth is farthest from the sun. This is what you get. Now, so all eclipses fall somewhere in this extreme. But if you notice, you get a much bigger area that's not covered for annular eclipse. So annular eclipses are actually more common than total solar eclipses because you most often get something closer to this extreme. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but the distance between the Earth and the Moon is not constant over millions of years either. There's something called tidal forces, which affects the distance between Earth and the Moon. And I'll show you a little bit about how this works. So, you get ocean tides when the Moon raises the ocean on the nearest side, nearest the Earth, by a few feet. And the forces of gravity from the Moon on the Earth and the Moon's oceans, there's also, of course, masses attract each other. The mass of the oceans attracts the Moon as well. And I'm sorry, I forgot to point out that when you look at the forces between that the Moon exerts on the tides and the tides exert back on the Moon, is the force is greater on the near side because the force of gravity is greater for the shorter distance, right? Of course, the force of gravity applied by the far component of the ocean's tide is much less. Now, the Earth rotates once every 24 hours, but the Moon takes 27 days to go once around. So what happens? What happens is the tides that are raised are constantly being rotated out of alignment with that force of gravity from the Moon. So what you see is, as the tides get rotated around the Earth, this mass here, and the gravitational component of that mass on the Moon, or the near tides, which is the greater force, all right, is now out of alignment with the force for the far tides. So these forces have diverged. Now, if you break this down, and I won't get into vector calculus or anything like that, but basically you can take your forces and break them into components. You've got a component toward the Earth, and you've got components that are tangential to the Moon's orbit. Well, you can see here that if you break down the force for the near tide, you get a component along the tangential to the Moon's orbit in this direction. All right, and you break the force from the far tide down into components, you get a component in the opposite direction. But you can see the component of the force in the direction on the near tide is greater than that of the one on the far tide. So what is the net effect of this? The net effect of this is a positive force that is accelerating the Moon into a higher orbit. Now, this is a pretty small force compared to the total tidal forces, but over millions of years, the Moon starts moving upward into a higher orbit. Now, likewise, as the Moon is speeding up and accelerating into a higher orbit, you have similar forces on the tides here on Earth, because there's a component of this force on the tide from the Moon that's opposing the Earth's rotation. So what you get is you get friction. So this force, the force of friction in the tide is actually slowing down the rotation of the Earth. This is pretty much why every few years or decades or so they add a leap nanosecond, right, or a leap second to the atomic clocks. It's because we're being slowed down. Now, if you look at this effect and project it millions or billions of years in the past and into the future, about 4.5 billion years ago, when the Moon is estimated to have been formed, it was only 14,000 miles away from the Earth. So its apparent diameter would be something like this, right? And the Sun would be this little dotted line right here. So every orbit would have produced a total solar eclipse, right? And no chance of it not covering it up. So today, we're sort of in a transitional period where we can see both annular and total solar eclipses. But projecting this out in the future, about 15 billion years from now, what will happen is these tidal forces will eventually put us to what's called tidal lock with the Moon. So the Earth will orbit at the same, Earth will rotate at the same rate that the Moon goes around it. So they will always have the same phase pointing at each other. So there won't be any more tidal friction. So the Moon will settle into an orbit at about 382,000 miles from the Earth, all right? And you would get this, it would look like this whenever the Moon eclipses the Sun. But
Do they have an estimate, when the moon is gonna break away from the Earth? Break the orbit?
Never heard that.
You never
I think
heard
that's probably a false.
Well, it
I
would
heard
happen,
that.
but the solar system might end before then.
There's no mechanism that I'm aware of that will cause the moon to break further away. Once you reach tidal lock, the effects of tidal forces are done. You're in a constant 382,000 miles, well, average.
Oh, it's not gonna continue to
No,
go farther?
the tidal forces, once the tidal forces are done, and you're not getting any tidal friction, and you're in that tidal lock,
Okay.
that's it.
What would the
Stay
day
right
be?
there.
15 billion.
No, I mean, what would the size of the day be at that point? How many hours?
I haven't looked at that part, I'd have to go look up and see what the estimate would be. So, yeah, let me finish the presentation here. So I want to close by pointing out that, as I pointed out on the previous slide, some would argue that, well, even if it has changed like this over time, you know, the fact that we're getting total solar eclipses now coincides with the birth of Jesus Christ. But that's not exactly a very good argument because that requires you to accept the premise that the biblical estimate of the age of the earth and moon is wildly inaccurate, to say the least. So, in closing, I want to point out this is the total solar eclipses coming up in August 21st of 2017. We'll enter somewhere around Oregon, cut across the entire center of the United States, and exit in South Carolina. Down here in Dallas-Fort Worth area, we will observe about 75% of the sun's surface being covered. And the eclipse will only appear total to people within the boundaries of these lines right here. All right? Okay, now, somebody had a question.
So as the moon moves away from the earth, and it's still gonna complete its 27-day cycle.
It'll take longer than
It's
27
gonna be
days.
longer now, that's what was my question. Would the moon run faster? Or it's gonna run out of
Slower.
juice and slow down?
Slower as it goes into a higher orbit, but it won't change, since it's only going from, what was it, an average of 230,000 miles to 238,000
So
miles.
it's gonna be the same, except, well, it's gonna take longer because the orbit is gonna be bigger.
Yeah, it'll probably be around 2 months. I'd have to figure that out.
So once in a blue moon is gonna be once in every 2-3 blue moons?
The blue moons have to do with the coincidence
It's a
of
joke.
when the moon is full. And since you asked, a blue moon is defined as when the moon is full, when it is at perigee, at closest approach to the Earth. It doesn't happen very often.
Pretty
Okay.
amazing to think that we can,
So then it never happened again. It never happened again.
predict when these eclipses are going to happen.
Full
In
moon.
fact, I think there's a,
And that
It would never happen again.
Thank you.
John Goche.
Yeah, but it won't happen.
Actually, how many have read
Yes.
Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court? You know, there's a part in there where he gets like thrown in jail and he decides, oh, I know how to get out. There's an eclipse going to happen in a couple days. You let me out of here or I'll blot out the sun. So, at any rate, thank you so much, John. Really appreciate that. And I think you're right. I think you sent me an amended set of slides and I didn't put those.
That's okay.
Beat me up with a wet tuna. So, here's a pattern. Right? What does that mean? So we know our ABCs. We recognize these things as letters. So we know they stand for something. It sounds, and we're literate in English, and we've learned our phonics, so we know these particular groupings of letters and know how to sound it out. The meaning of life. But even knowing all that doesn't tell us what the meaning of life is or what this phrase means. It depends what we mean by life and by meaning. Meaning has to do with what something represents, what it stands for, or simply what it's for, its purpose, or it can refer to any number of things connected with whatever something means. So right away we see it's not so simple. What is the meaning of this? Nothing to sound out, no words, letters.
Slippery road
If you're a
ahead.
driver and you've learned this, so there's the slippery road ahead. I like this one even better. Does it mean the same thing? I first saw that when I visited Australia. Notice the road is so slippery that your axles reverse.
It means drunk driver.
Notice that between that and this. So how about this? What does that mean? Well, that's what you get when you run something through a mass spectrometer to find out what it's made of. The horizontal shows the mass versus the M/Z mass charge ratio, and the horizontal shows the abundance. So the bigger the heat, the more of the stuff you have in there. So that's one way you can figure out what something's made of. So information can be extracted from this, even though it's not like a road sign that it's meant to mean something. You know, you put it through the mass spectrometer, and that's the pattern you get, and we're the ones who figure out what the meaning is. So it's a process by which it's produced. And we could say the same of this, although no one had a part in making it. So nothing means anything by it. What's a way to turn off one of the front lines? There we go, and I can still see my comments. Very beautiful. That was taken by the Hubble Wide Field Planetary Camera in August 2008. So this is about 100 light years wide. It's about 170,000 light years away, which means it looked like this long before human history began, around the time when anatomically modern humans first appeared. But still, there's some features of this, undoubtedly, that mean something to astronomers who study these things today. They can tell something by looking at pattern measurements and so forth. And how about this? Well, it's just rock, right? So it's meaningless, right? Well, it certainly, again, isn't meant to mean anything, but someone who knows geology could probably identify this variety of rock. Any geologists here could tell us whether that's basalt or granite or what it is. But someone who knew could tell us the composition and the history and so forth. That might even recognize where that's from, possibly. So it actually does have meaning. And likewise, clouds are just the products of natural forces, but that doesn't make them meaningless, since we can all see things in clouds, rather like we can see things in ink blots. Anybody see any faces in there, for example? Again, for someone who understands cloud formation and weather phenomena, clouds can mean something in their description classification and the conditions of their formation and their likely destiny. If Winnie the Pooh were here, he might say, "Tut tut, looks like rain." And so finally with life, we've been able to figure out quite a lot about life as a biological phenomenon, some of it only quite recently. We've only known the structure of DNA and how that structure contributes to reproduction and heredity since 1953. So what would this mean to someone in 1916? You went back in time, showed this to somebody in 1916, what does that mean? If we think of life as existence, then we're also in luck. Only in the last 100 years we've built up this picture of the last 13.8. I'm going to turn that down a little bit. Wrong direction. No, that's better. So, you know, this just kind of shows about everything we can observe for the last 13.8 billion years. Much more recently now, of course, now we have reason to think that even what we can see is only 4 to 5% of the matter and energy in the universe. 4 to 5%. And the rest is dark matter and dark energy that's only detectable through its gravitational effect. So now we've got more time to figure out what 95, 96% of the universe is. But all that's not good enough when it comes to the meaning of life, is it? So I have a short video to show you next. It's always the 15 point you go to, right?
Many millions of years ago, a race of hyper-intelligent, pan-dimensional beings got so fed up with the constant bickering about the meaning of life that they commissioned 2 of their brightest and best to design and build a stupendous supercomputer to calculate the answer to life, the universe, and everything.
Oh, Freethought, we want you to tell us the answer.
The answer to what?
The answer to life, the universe, everything. We'd really like an answer. Something
about that. Return to this place in exactly 7.5 million years.
Finished? No, that's fine. They go back, 7.5 million years later. That's right, they do.
Freethought. You
An
haven't...
answer for you? Yes, but you're not going to like it.
Doesn't matter, we must know it.
All right. The answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything is 42. Yes, I thought it over quite thoroughly. Jeez, it's 42. It would have been simpler, of course, to have known what the actual question was.
But it was the question. The ultimate question. Of everything.
That's not a question. Only when you know the question will you know what the answer means.
Give us the ultimate question then.
I can't. But there is one who can. A computer that will calculate the ultimate question. A computer of such infinite complexity that life itself will form part of its operational matrix. And you yourselves shall take on new, more primitive forms and go down into the computer to navigate its 10-million-year program. I shall design this computer for you, and it shall be called...
So you know that's from Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or the Universe.
Yeah.
So I used to joke with my kids that the reason we had them is so that they could tell us what the meaning of life was. And then when I asked them, I said, "So now that you're older and can talk," and that they'd seen this, and then they just said 42. But why do we keep asking about the meaning of life? What does that mean? Or perhaps more than a point. What is it that we're really asking? And I've got another video here for you. There we go. Got that here on all times.
Michio, here we are, scientists, human beings, who seem to have our hands on the fundamental nature of reality. Quantum physics at the smallest area, general relativity, and all the remarkable discoveries of cosmology, seeking a final theory, perhaps string theory. We're getting very close on the smallest scale and on the larger scale to really understanding it. Can now we step back and ask the questions that our ancestors asked, that are asked by religions, that are asked by philosophers? Is there any meaning to all of this? Is there any reason? Can we ask the why question?
Well, I think it is legitimate to ask the why questions because in some sense, our role in the universe, where do we fit in this larger scheme of things? That's the ultimate goal of science itself. Now remember that there's conflicts when Galileo, for example, turned his telescope to the heavens. People immediately asked him, where's heaven? Where's heaven? What is the purpose of life? The purpose of life is to live a good life to go to heaven. That's why we are here. That gives us meaning to praise God, to go to heaven. And they asked Galileo, where's heaven? And Galileo looked, and he looked. And we're still looking. And we see no heaven up there. And so science forces us to push back the boundaries of what we know, where we are in the scheme of things. And I think it's a good thing, because I think we know where we stand with regards to the much larger universe. Now, some people say, well, if you're so smart, you physicists know so much, is there a unified theory of happiness? Is there a unified theory of meaning to it all? Well, I personally don't believe that there is an equation out there written in the sky which says, this is it, folks. This is the meaning of the universe. This is what you've been struggling for. I don't see that. However, I do see the search for a theory of everything illuminating how we fit into the larger scheme of things, our role in the universe. But then people say, but that's not what I want to know. I want to know, what's in it for numero uno? What's my meaning in life? And I tell people the following. It's too easy to have meaning just plopped down from the heavens onto our lap. That's too easy. We have to work for it. We have to create our own meaning. And this is what I tell people. I say that there's no equation out there that can give meaning to your life. You have to find meaning for yourself. It is a process of self-discovery. That it's too easy for us to simply have an equation that says, okay, this is it, folks, this is the meaning of the universe. It's a process of self-discovery. Now, for me, example, I tend to think that all of us are born with certain talents, certain abilities, and we have to reach the maximum of our capabilities and potential. Why? To make the world a better place. To make sure that we leave the universe, we leave the world a better place than we first entered. Now, that doesn't mean that the trumpets are blaring when I make that statement. But for me, this is my purpose in life.
Well, certainly, whatever your purpose is, whatever your imagined meaning is, if it's personal or it's derived from some religion, it now must conform to the laws of physics that are being discovered at the micro level, at the quantum level, at the technological level. Anything that has any claim to veracity and truth must conform to that. I mean, that's a given. Beyond that is the question. And is there some larger purpose, or is the only purpose that which we derive? And maybe some would say artificially. Maybe the meaning that you're talking about is sort of trying to tack on artificially a meaning to where no meaning exists. Why don't you come clean and say, as a scientist, here are the laws, you have to conform to it, I don't see meaning in it, and that's it.
Well, I think there's a spectrum of answers that you get when you interview cosmologists and theoretical physicists. On one hand, you have the people who say the universe is pointless. There is no point, dummy. You're trying to put human values on something that has no human values. On the other hand, you will get physicists, mainly old-fashioned ones, but they say that the purpose of life is to glorify God. That's why they discovered the laws of physics. Discovering the laws of physics to them is a way of glorifying God. End of story. That's the purpose of the universe. Well, I don't think that this scale is the proper way in which to look at the full dimension of things. I personally don't think that you're going to find meaning in a unified field theory. An equation which explains electrons and neutrons and protons is not going to make you happy, okay? I say there is meaning in the universe. There is such a thing as meaning in the universe, but it's personally created. You have to define your own meaning. Otherwise, it's a cop-out. Otherwise, you're simply saying that I'm going to get some message from on heaven, an email from outer space saying, okay, this is the meaning of life, go live it. I don't believe in that. I say to people, you search for meaning. Search inside yourself, because that's where true meaning is going to be found. Because if I tell you that the meaning of life is this equation, you're not going to believe me.
Okay.
And it's not going to affect your life.
Okay. We're putting that off the table, that there's not going to be some ultimate guidelines, some ultimate equations, some ultimate
No email from heaven.
No email from heaven, or part of a book or something that's going to tell you the way it is, but something that you infer, that you create yourself. But that just sounds like a rationalization to me. It's trying to impose something that nothing, maybe it'll make us feel better, and I'm all for that. Take care of the earth, take care of our families, that's fine. But at the end of the day, it is really kind of irrelevant.
I don't think so, because it gives structure and meaning to life. Freud, for example, was asked, what is the meaning of life, right? And he said, well, what gives us structure, what gives us meaning in life are two things, okay? To work and to love. And if you think about it, we as human beings need to work, we need to love, or else we go insane. We go crazy, we go off the deep end, as they say. We live a pointless life, a pointless existence, unless we work to some productive goal and we love. And I think that's a very foundational question, that any theory of meaning has to embrace the very foundations of who we are, that we have to work and we have to love. Now, what does theoretical physics say about this? Well, it may talk about creation, it may talk about the harmony of the universe, the glories of equations and so on and so forth, but it's not going to tell you how to be a better person. It's not going to fulfill that yawning gap inside your soul that says, why am I here to begin with? And that's why I say the process of self-discovery is the way to do it. To some people, they say, well, it's a cop-out. I want that email from heaven. Hey, it's not coming.
There's the email from heaven.
That was terrible.
Sorry about that.
You awake?
What?
You fell asleep in the darkness, so now you're awake. Well, I thought that was interesting. You know, Michio Kaku is not a philosopher. Well, he is a philosopher to some degree. It's kind of interesting how, and he talks about why he went into theoretical physics. He thought that would get him closer to, you know, really what everything was all about. But clearly people, each one of us, asks, what is the meaning of life? Meaning, what is the point, the purpose, the significance of my life? So you would ask that about your life, your existence, your experience, and what shall you do with your life? And now, if we accept that the answer is a deity or a holy book, or an afterlife, or becoming one with the universe, or string theory, or even the obliteration of self. At another point, Kaku talks about his parents being Buddhist, and how that affected his view. Even if we say the answer is 42, then really what you've done is you've given up. We have, out of laziness or frustration or desperation, given up on being an end in ourselves and have become a means to someone else's end. And that's the interesting thing about the universe and the meaning of life. There's always somebody else who's willing, if you're willing to accept it, to tell you this is the meaning of your life and turn you into a means to their ends. But the real answer, as Michio Kaku says here, and many others have said it before him, is that the meaning of life is in the living. It's in the actual experience of your existence and of your personal voyage of self-discovery that you discover or appreciate the meaning of your life. It's not just that it's not easy, as Kaku says, it's that it doesn't come all at once, but it comes slowly over time, like a growing, living thing itself. And maybe this is why it's sometimes said that the meaning of life cannot be understood by looking forward, but only by looking backward. It also helps to take a kind of impartial attitude towards our lives. That's another if there's anything difficult to do, it's that, to take a step back and say, well, how would the proverbial person from Mars look at your life? The type of standpoint that you might take when you ask about the meaning of rocks, clouds, nebulae, and even the universe as a whole. So we went through the videos. All right. There was a man, a wealthy, successful businessman, who sold all his possessions and left his family to travel the world because he wanted to know the meaning of life. After many years of seeking and near despair, his last hope was a guru who lived high up on a very dangerous mountain. So up the mountain the man went, through blizzards and storms, desperate and hungry once he used up all of his provisions. He was cold, he became injured in an accident, was using a piece of a tree branch for a cane, and finally near the top of the mountain there sat the guru outside his cave, the clouds up in this strange, surreal type of place, swirling around and the sunshine breaking through. And the man struggled forward and falling down, gasped, "Oh, wise one, I've given up everything to find the truth, but it will all be worthwhile if you can answer my question, what is the meaning of life?" And the guru smiled and said, "My son, here is the answer you seek. Life is a fountain." After a long pause, the man shook his head. "A fountain? I've come thousands of miles to hear your wisdom. Everything I once had is gone. I'm starving, thirsty, and cold. I'll probably die on this mountain. All you have to say is, life is a fountain?" And there was another pause, and the guru trembled and said, "You mean it's not a fountain?" There's a whole variety variety of alternate endings to this story and also continuations of it. In one, instead of protesting, the seeker of wisdom nods his head and says, "Oh, thank you. That is so profound. Life is a fountain." But a fountain of what? So we can literally do a whole service on that story and others like it, where people are seeking. But notice this, is it really in the seeking for an answer that the man feels that his life has meaning? That's really what he feels like he's on the path, looking for the answers. The quest itself motivates him and gives him the hope and the strength to go on. Once he hears about life as a fountain, then he thinks about, I'm probably going to die up here. And what sort of answer would anyone accept as being the meaning of life anyway? There's more in today's bulletin, especially about why it's useless, harmful really, to look to supernaturalism for an answer. So think about it, and Aristotle's mentioned in the bulletin also. I've asked Lee and also Will to think about sharing with us their idea of what the meaning of life is, and you said you had something to say about that. Lee, come on up and help us out. So we'll just call that the meaning of life.
For how we think of ourselves and describe our convictions to others, but also in how we think of ourselves in relation to religious faith believers and in legal presentations to the courts in First Amendment matters. The way the First Amendment is phrased introduces some tensions. Congress may make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And of course, this was applied to the states via the 14th Amendment. We need to reject at the outset that every personal view is a religion. Obviously, humans differ as to whether their understanding of life is based on God belief, various spirit traditions, and supernatural superstitions, or based on experiences and rational understandings. The differences between reliance on church or scriptural authority and other evidence is interesting. Perhaps it's genetic, but surely related to early childhood experiences and conditionings. However, those with a faith belief are content that it makes sense to them. But cognitive dissonance and faith belief rarely go hand in hand. A preference is not a religion. My preference for carrots over potatoes does not make me a carrotist. In a sense, almost everyone is an atheist. Christians are atheists with regard to Zeus and Allah. Hindus are atheists with regard to Jehovah. And so it goes. Atheism seems fairly universal. People only get exercise when their special God is the one disbelieved in. And when people ask me if I'm not interested in a long discourse, I usually say, I'm not sure. I just believe in one less God than you do. And atheists are amazingly feared and despised in our country. During the course of the Supreme Court case that became known as Abington versus Champlin, Murray versus Curlett, Murray and Samples Medal of Murray, we received about 5,000 letters. About 1/3 were supportive. About 1/3 were opposed, where you might say that reasonable people might differ, and 1/3 were simply hateful and vituperative. One of the things we found amusing was we were accused of being the incarnation of whatever the writer hated. What are you? Commies? Well, you expect that. What are you? Jews? What are you? Nazis? What are you? Catholics? Then we got someone that said, what are you? Baptists? I particularly remember those who said, in the name of Christ, go to hell. I don't recall any letter that accusingly asked, what are you, Zoroastrians? Perhaps nobody hates Zoroastrians, and you might want to look into it. But we did learn that atheists are the most hated group in America. And I mentioned Madeline Murray because the two cases actually came from different lower court histories and reached the Supreme Court at the same time, and the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, joined the two cases and issued one opinion that covered both the Abington case and the Madeline Murray case. Madeline Murray, of course, is very famous down here in Texas. I'm not sure whether Madeline advanced atheism or impeded it. She was colorful, she was brave maybe to the level of foolishness, but I always mention that the case is actually known as Abington versus Champlin, Murray versus Curlett. And of course, it's extremely sad but wherever her strengths and weaknesses, she was viciously murdered in 1996. I argue that humanism and its variations are not religions, that atheism is not a religion, except maybe under some very special legal arguments. One can see the pitfalls if the issue is stated as secular humanism or atheism is just another religion, vis-a-vis the fundamentalist scriptural literalists, and that who are trying to open a backdoor way of trying to get religion back into the schools. Secularism is clearly not a religion. It is the philosophical or political view that government should be neutral in personal religious matters. Secular, if you look it up in the dictionary, means without regard to religion as the public policy. It is what our Constitution is. Our Constitution begins with, we the people do ordain and establish. Our Constitution calls upon no divine blessings for the future of this country. It is vitally important that we understand a position for governments to be neutral, neither favoring religious organizations nor hindering personal religious beliefs. It is very important to recognize neutrality in government. Faith believers are fond of charging hostility to their belief system. You are either for us or against us. Well, this is a false dichotomy that slyly defines neutrality out of the discussion. Despite being grotesquely wrong as an intellectual argument, that happens to be the position of the Catholic Church and many others, and it is widely accepted by Americans who come to believe there are two sides to every issue. Well, in fact, most issues are political. There are many forms of attack on separation of church and state. We remember that capturing the power of secular government has been a frequent objective of priests and pastors, mullahs and imams, of all stripes, in promoting their faith interests. But secular humanism, Unitarian Universalists, Freethought groups seem to assert values, life principles, and beliefs in untestable assumptions. This does not constitute a religion either. Merely believing something or disbelieving does not make it religion, nor does holding to values constitute a religion. Nor is belief or non-belief by itself religious in nature. Every idea cannot be forced under a religious umbrella. But because of this tendency, I try to avoid saying, I believe. For example, I believe in evolution. It is better and more accurate to say, I accept that evolution is a good description of life on Earth. I think that reliance on human intellect for understanding the natural world is better than relying on holy books. And that is exactly what one of the slides was earlier. When we say, I believe, we risk having one belief set against another. Fairness then suggests that the two beliefs are equal. But I think it's different. After all, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own set of facts. I think that humans have invented morality. I reject the notion that supernatural beings are responsible for our laws. The notion that ethical behavior arises from some deity or fear of damnation from some priest, preacher, Allah is simply absurd. This secular humanist rejection is not a religious viewpoint. It is simply accepting materialistic naturalism and the importance of social connections in us humans. One important distinction is that secular humanists do not define or talk about sin. The notion of sin is very important in religious communities. Non-sinning is not religious. The values and concepts of secular humanism can be described equally well as civic, social, or democratic in nature. It's true, they may overlap with some religious ideas and teachings, but overlap does not make them a religion. And using emotional or poetic, or some might even say religious language, does not make us religious either. Creative language that appeals to feelings is part of creative use of words for influencing ourselves and others. But no one would ever say that language is a religious art. Disbelief in supernatural entities is not a religion. Not collecting stamps is not a hobby. Not believing in the logic of sponsor is not a religion. Likewise, my disbelief in intercessionary prayer is merely disbelief based upon my evaluation of the logic and evidence. I actively disbelieve in psychics, palm readers, astrology, telepathy, and original sin. It's very hard to be original in sinning nowadays. But merely being vocal about it does not turn my skepticism into a religion. Actually, if you think about it, it is amazing how many crazy notions one can disbelieve in. From gods to homeopathy to 100,000 mile per gallon carburetors to unicorns and Bigfoot. Merely because secular humanists are members of more and more groups that share values and concepts does not make them religious organizations. The Freemasons and the American Legion are not religious organizations under any sensible definition. Secular humanism is not a religion, nor is materialistic naturalism. But there may be a problem when freethinkers and humanists want to organize as a kind of church. Here, we do want equality, recognize tax exemption, all the benefits of traditional churches. But merely getting together for discussion, for affirmations of core values, does not make a religion. When astronomers assemble for a scientific convention, that does not make astronomy a religion. I think the answer to this is that we can be a charitable organization under the tax codes, but we have to give up calling ourselves a religious organization or denomination. The use of descriptive labels does not turn an ideal or personal outlook into a religion. The opposition loves to find labels that they hope will be pejorative. In their world, there are Darwinists, evolutionists, Marxists, all sorts of this. That is because the Christists think that everything derives from a single person. I hope to live long enough to become a Shintoist. And what about ceremonies, rituals, and traditions? Many of us freethinkers were raised in some kind of tradition, maybe a religious one. Early childhood experiences are very powerful. I myself love Christmas trees, but I do not for an instant think they are representative of any miracle child from 2,000 years ago. I merely think they are fun and pretty. I think public ceremonies have value. In some fashion, they provide a unifying social force. And for me, celebration of the winter solstice arises from very ancient traditions and myths. If it overlaps with Christian or Jewish beliefs, that's their problem. And having ceremonies or rituals does not make a group a religious one. After all, there are the Freemasons and the Boy Scouts and the Pledge of Allegiance. With us, the pledge. If anything ought to be recognized as a superstitious witch doctor kind of religion, that would come high on the list. So, here are our choices, I think. Choice 1. Humanism is an equal religious point of view and deserves equal status with other organized religions. Choice 2. Humanism is an outlook on the world and is equivalent to personal and political outlooks described in popular discourse as liberal, conservative, libertarian, traditionalist, constitutionalist, fundamentalist, literalist, whatever. But labels do not make a religion. And I think humanism is securely related to common sense and an open-minded outlooks of the world. Choice 3, of course, is that we do not like being categorized, and we reject both the other two choices and insist on a different description. Herding cats comes to mind. Choice 1 seems appealing at first, but it is burdened with difficulties. Insofar as secular humanist people respect the natural world and scientific methods for understanding our lives, we do not accept psychics, creationists, evil eye, astrologists, superstitions as being on an equal basis. We reject teach the controversy as being fraudulent. One can invent controversies about absolutely everything, and calling them equal religious views is dishonest. But in socio-legal terms, secular humanist people object to religious prayers in school boards and city councils on the grounds that religious exercises are not part of the business of government. Such actions violate the principle of secularism and the Establishment Clause. Non-prayer is not a religion. Let's get on with the business of the community. And if some prayer was of interest to the individual board members, there was adequate time in private before the meeting. Public display of piety is not a business of government. And insisting on a public display smacks equally of an arrogance that all share the belief, and equally of some superstitious ritual incantation. The opinion that secular humanism is just another religion is dangerous. It allows any creationist or evangelical group to argue that they are being oppressed by the secular humanist religions. And it shifts discussion away from what is fair and sensible as to, in the direction as to who is winning or losing. And then the discussion is really about who has the power. The second choice I mentioned, we do, of course, accept free exercise as meaning freedom of belief in any sort of religious or superstitious stuff. Although this is not absolute. Human sacrifice is not allowed. And you can't hold a prayer vigil in the middle of a freeway, no matter how devout you are. But because freedom to exercise does not mean freedom to exercise does not mean freedom to impose. Civic values, democratic values, humanist values exceed evangelical values via the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. It's a bit analogous to speech. Is silence speech? Well, clearly not when you define speech as the exchange of spoken words. Yet constitutionally, remaining silent is exercising one's free speech right. Well, materialistic naturalism or naturalistic materialism is not exactly my topic. Objectivism, reliance on scientific methodologies are areas of philosophy. And this would greatly expand my talk very far into my areas of ignorance. But I point out that philosophies are not religions. I'm going to conclude by saying that we as humanists are under different umbrellas, and we vary as to whether we are Republicans or Democrats, as to which of our political ideas and leadership may be better for our society and our country. We do not gather to worship, but for fellowship and exchange of ideas. Whether we call our groups churches or societies or not, or something else, does not matter to me. But church is fine. Traditional ecclesiastical organizations do not own a word. So what I think is that we freethinkers and humanists are a pretty marvelous group, with wonderful capacities for thinking, for seeing beauty in our own lives, for loving our planet and our fellow man, for loving our families and friends. Beauty, love, and justice, as well as separation of church and state, are great ideas, but they do not make a religion. And these ideas do not have to. Creationists try desperately to find a scientific basis for their beliefs because they see science as powerful and want to wrap themselves in its mantle. Arguing that secular humanism is a religion sort of falls into the same trap. We see that religion is powerful and want to wrap ourselves in its mantle. I say, let's give it up. We can have equal status. We are not a religion, but we're a pretty damn nice bunch of people, and that's enough for me. Thank you much.
Thanks so much for talking to us today. Ellery, these are all issues and questions that we have fun with, argue about, dream about, and we're all about trying out these new options in a brave new world. We would like to express our appreciation in a very small way. We have a little crumb of our involvement in state church litigation in the form of our amicus brief to the Supreme Court of the United States in the Newdow case, which includes complete reproduction of the American Religious Identification Survey in the back, which we try to call the Supreme Court's attention to in terms of the numbers of unbelievers who should not be dismissed as being religious nothings and just completely disregarded and written roughshod over with this under God phrase. And we have personalized that with signatures of the officers within, and we would like you to take that as a small token of our appreciation.
Quite well. We get along very handsomely, and takes a somewhat different view on this. Whether atheism is a religion, we'll judge this.
Thank you very much.
And Dr. Smith, do you have some time for some questions? Anybody who would like to come on up to the mic and ask Dr. Shem some questions? We do have a few minutes for that. I'll go ahead and start off, actually. What could you provide us in terms of your historical perspective? The graph I showed that the Protestant denominations were dropping and unaffiliated. Do you think that's something that's going to be increasing into the future? Do you see the pendulum swinging in our direction?
I rarely pray, but I hope that it goes in the right direction. No, I'm absolutely sure. I think that, many kinds of superstitions, the origin of disease, for example, have been put aside as we've learned, humans have learned more things. And traditional religions are not providing particularly good benefits. I think there's a recognition in the country that faith-based government has been a failure. And the idea that more praying, or more Bible reading, or more Quran reading is going to solve our problems is no longer being very much respected. I didn't read exactly the percentage, but one percentage I read for people who are unaffiliated is around 14%, maybe it's 17% now, varies. And I'm sure the actual number is higher than that. But I'd like to point out that although 14% sounds like a small number, that actually represents 42 million American citizens. 42 million is not a small number.
First of all, Dr. Shemp, I just want to let you know you're not seeing double. There are two Santas in this church.
I was born.
First of all, I just want to say that ironically, I think you have proven psychic ability to me, because everything you said is everything I've thought for years. It's like, oh, he's in my head. I really appreciate that. Second is a point of trivia, and that is that now in 2008, I may be one of only a handful of people who have met both parties in the landmark 1963 case, because I used to work with Madeline O'Hare back in the 70s. So it's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Shemp, one thing I'd like to ask is, a lot of times in talking to Christians, when you say you're an atheist, they assert that, that's something that's logically impossible to prove or to really believe. How do you address the issue of whether saying that you're an atheist is something that is really something you can logically defend, or that it doesn't just constitute an assertion or belief?
Well, I don't think I have to defend it. People can believe any kind of crazy things. And anybody who's been up late night in college dormitories discussing the existence of God knows that the discussion is ultimately futile. So what I always say is, it's simply not an important idea to me. I just don't think that any part of our morality, any part of our understanding of the natural world is enhanced by invoking a God concept. So I would just say, the idea is useless as far as I'm concerned. And that's, they don't have a good answer to that. And, if you really want to get, as I mentioned, the explanation that God did it, that's no explanation either. And there's no harm in saying, I don't know. Where did the universe come from? Big Bang, that was before the Big Bang. I don't know. And I don't know is very honest. But merely saying, invoking the soul of God, or a God, that doesn't help us at all.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Your point that atheism is not a religion, I didn't really hear you say Freethought was not a religion. What is your view on the fact that we call ourselves a church? We've actually gone through the mechanisms for the state to get ourselves declared as a church for tax exemption purposes and so forth, and that we actually do spend a lot of our time discussing religious ideas. So I want your input on whether you think it's even a good idea to call ourselves a church.
Well, as I said, I don't think that the traditionalists own the word church, so anybody can call themselves a church. Would the American Chemical Society call itself a church? No, they won't, of course. But if you were to call your group the Freethought Society instead of the Freethought Church, would anything be different? So, yes. In no sense, why?
The church is much more emotionally loaded word.
Ah, that is certainly true. And it has a certain kind of in-your-face aspect about it, right? So I don't have any quarrel with that at all. But I don't think it's necessary. Unitarian Universalists call themselves churches too. And I belong to a church in which the word God is very, very rarely mentioned. And nobody comes to this church with the idea of worshiping anything. But I think I would argue that what we call ourselves really doesn't matter in the long run. And if you want to be, I don't know, aggressive about it, calling yourself a church is fine. But we could probably call ourselves. I mean, the ethical cultural people, for example, talk about religious values and in ways that could equally well be described as a church, but they call themselves a society organization.
It's certainly wonderful to hear you, Dr. Schimm. I have a kind of a follow-up question, history question. What you did as a young man took a lot of courage. I was just curious about some insights, what you were thinking at the time, what all you had to put up with. I mean, I congratulate you for that, but that really took a lot of personal courage, a lot of personal fortitude on your part and on your family.
Everyone loves a hero, but I have to disappoint you because it really didn't take all that much. We lived in a community that was pretty decent and didn't expect to have crosses burned on the front lawn or something. My brother was roughed up for a long time, of course, it wasn't even known, only when it hit the newspapers and got into some headlines. Then my brother was roughed up and pushed around, knocked down a couple times. Not good, but not too terribly serious. As was mentioned in the introduction, my sister was absolutely mortified, and we had some very emotional discussions around the family dinner table because she felt that it was a big social impairment to her. But intellectually, she agreed with it. And of course, for one of us kids, none of it would have happened without my parents because 16-year-olds can't bring court cases. And we did not suffer nearly as much as the Murrays did because the Murrays had that very nasty word atheist in their title, and she was very proud of it. We belonged to a Unitarian Universalist church. Nobody knew what that meant, but it had the magic word church in it. One thing that I didn't know at the time, but learned later, that my school principal wrote a letter of disrecommendation to every college that I applied to. Wow. And we even went so far that after I was accepted at Tufts, he actually called the admissions director and said, "You made a terrible, terrible mistake. You need to rescind this immediately. You will forever regret it." But the Murrays, their kids were beat up badly. Their house was firebombed. The police department took a particularly circuitous route to get there. The police department didn't provide them any protection. And eventually she fled Maryland for fear of her life or fear of a terrible injustice. And that's how she wound up here in Texas. So the situations were really quite different.
Being here in North Texas is quite an experience. Whether I go to a political meeting or I go to the Senior Citizen Center, we always have prayer everywhere I go. And I don't know, yeah, even rodeos. And I remember in high school, of course, always our football teams pray for. And there doesn't seem to be any end to this or any way to stop it because I found it, it's impinging on my belief system. Do you have any insight into this phenomenon?
It's hard to find a legal place to beat up on these kinds of practices. We can certainly raise an objection. Well, it's school football games, that's been pretty well decided by the Supreme Court. One thing I do like to remind people, 2 points. First of all, we freethinkers, humanists, who use separation of church and state people, ACLU, Americans United, Freedom from Religion Foundation, we can't win unless we have a certain unity. And I'm a very great supporter of the Secular Coalition for America because it represents an umbrella group where we can, whatever we call ourselves, can work together for common aims. It's very significant that the Secular Coalition has, because of the support of many member organizations, which are 14 or 16 nowadays, has been able to hire, for the first time, a full-time lobbyist who goes to Congress. She's Lori Lippman Brown. She's been doing an excellent job, and she's representing humanist separation of church and state values in Congress. Well, I think that's a very significant thing and gives us a voice at the table. So, if we don't all work together, we will surely hang together. And the other point I'd like to make is that there was this wonderful time of the Warren Court, and Abington case began those couple of years after the McCarthy era, when the communist treason under every bed. It was only a couple of years after the Brown versus Topeka desegregation decision in Kansas. It was only 2 years, after, amusingly enough, after the phrase "under God" was inserted in the pledge in 1954, at the behest of the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic organization, in order to distinguish us from the godless communists. Well, the Warren Court did a lot of wonderful things, but the courts change. And it's not clear to me, in fact it's pretty obvious to me, that the present court would come to some very, very different decisions. And that's rather scary. And I've actually been not so encouraging to Mike Ludow, because I think, although he's entirely right, this is maybe not the right timing for such a case in these courts. But what's the bottom line of this is, in the long run, you've got to win elections. The court is determined by the political powers, and you can't always depend on having good justices. We've got now 5 members of the Supreme Court are Catholic. I don't think that's Catholic justices, but somehow that's a bit of an imbalance. 5% of the country is not Catholic, and not of this particularly conservative, ultra-conservative stripe. You've got to win elections, and the court does read newspapers.
Yes, it's encouraging to know the secular coalition has got a lobbyist. Too bad President Obama is going to get rid of all the lobbyists, or at least not necessarily. But you're entirely right. Our use of the word church and all is a little bit of a defense mechanism down here in the Bible Belt, and also to make the point that, of course, banding together, being an organization, we can do some things that individuals would just not be able to do, or would not be safe for them to do. And the other thing I think is that many of us do take some stock in Stephen J. Gould's idea of non-overlapping magisteria, and that this is really one of the best ways to defeat the IDE folks and all the rest of them, is to point out that, look, there's a huge realm of human understanding that has to do with objective facts, reasoning, things that we can all put our hands on, and we can build machines, fling satellites out into the universe to measure and document. And that is an area that simply is not religious, that this was a battle that was won back in Galileo's day, and the church lost. Religion's lost. And that what needs to happen now is that sensible people in all the different religious faiths, the ones that say, oh, we all worship the same God, meaning they all have the same values in terms of what we would imagine an ideal being to be like. In other words, not one who tortures people, drowns little children, and all of that. Most of us, of course, focus on the fundamentalist Christians. But what is your comment then on the idea of this non-overlapping magisteria, that there are things that science can't inform us, and if people want to get together and fellowship and all that sort of thing on that, that's probably going to be something that's going to continue for a long time into the future, regardless of what you call it.
Well, I'm not so willing to be sweeping that science won't inform us. I think the science of how our brains work, we're learning a heck of a lot more about it now. And as I said, I believe that our brains work on the basis of electromagnetic forces and chemical forces, and I don't see any other forces that are likely to be at play here. Now, there's a big step between that and understanding what self-awareness is, what consciousness is, and that's subjective. I have a feeling that we're probably going to understand it. What that's going to do in terms of our concepts of ourselves, I don't know. The trouble with the non-overlapping magisteriums is that the fundamentalists will always try to put the rationalists in a category that makes them equal and therefore attackable. And I think that I'd like to carve out a realm for ourselves that is, we think better than you guys do, and we should sort of give it out of respect of our own right. I'm a little bit reminded of a bumper sticker that says, I won't pray in your school. If you don't pray in my school, I promise not to think in your church.
One real quick question. You said that you were raised in a Universalist church, I guess. Unitarian. Can you tell me what your parents' beliefs were and how you were raised, as far as whether you were encouraged to seek the
Unitarianism grew out of, actually evolved from the Puritan movement in New England, became the Congregational movement, which then became the Congregationalist movement, and then they actually became the Unitarian movement, which, to my mind, is a clear sign that evolution is the right idea. Unitarians traditionally, and most Christians don't recognize that they're actually Trinitarians, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost business. And Unitarians from the very earliest times took a different view that there was a single Godhead, and there was a big fight about that in the Council of Nicaea, and the Unitarianist view was, and it was suppressed as heresy thereafter. But as it evolved in the New World, the idea was to focus more on life on this earth rather than the life in the hereafter, more on social justice and how we treat our fellow man rather than abstract concepts, theological notions. And it has, so the whole history of Unitarianism I can't go through. But a number of important social reformers and prison reform, acceptance of germ theory disease and treatment of the mentally ill were pioneered, and the founder of Red Cross, I think, were Unitarians. We've had a distinguished history. And fighting for civil rights was a very important thing when I was growing up. Now, my father was raised in a very traditional Lutheran church and came to reject these views, but Grandma was the matriarch of the family and was a very powerful person. So rejecting that Grandma's family belief was not an easy step for my dad. And I think during most of my time, he had some kind of vague belief that there was a higher power. But I can assure you that as his life went on, he came to doubt more and more that the concept of God was useful. Died as a staunch non-believer and a secular journalist. And my mother also came to doubt that any scriptural, but she was not raised in the church belief system at all. It was never very militant about it, but I know that she died too as a humanist.
This is a good follow-up question to the last one. What do you think of, I believe it's Christopher Hitchens' idea that liberal churches, especially Unitarians as an example, are enablers of the fundamentalists by their refusal to denounce their superstition-based source of their ideas?
I don't know which churches you're referring to, but I can't think of any Unitarian Universalists that would accept in any way, shape, or form a literal interpretation of the Bible. It's often, it used to be said in the 19th century that Unitarians believed in the brotherhood of man, the fatherhood of God, and the neighborhood of Boston. The fatherhood of God part has been dropped, and the neighborhood of Boston is waning. Brotherhood of man, I think, still stands.
I understood that the Unitarians basically want everyone to follow their own path and develop their own religion, and it's okay with them no matter how wacky it gets.
There's an element of that, I confess, but I think there's an element of that amongst the humanists and amongst the Wiccans and the pagans and the freethinkers too. I mean, this group obviously believes that individual thought is equally valid, even if it's sometimes others of us think it's wacky. And so, whenever you get a group of people together, there's going to be a bell-shaped curve. So I don't agree with Christopher Hitchens there. I think that Unitarians Unitarian Universalists have actually moved the traditional denominations, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and whatever, towards more liberal positions in many areas.
Okay. Are you familiar with the ideas in Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, and if so, what's your opinion of them?
Well, I was very much influenced when I was a high school student because I read Common Sense and Age of Reason. I thought that Thomas Paine was one of the forgotten members of our founding fathers, and I have great respect for his writings.
Keep it.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shemp. It's been an extraordinary pleasure, of course, to have him here and speak to our church. Before we leave, I do want to make a quick reminder, Freethought is not free. We do use the name church like other churches do, and we also require donations just like other churches do. You know, organizing this, putting this together, the new projector we had to buy, that all costs money, and we need that to come from you. So if you could please place your generous tax deductible, since we are a church, we do get that benefit, donation, the rainbow colored box that Bill Wall is holding up in the back. Cash checks, anything you'd like to stick in there would be great. We also have a PayPal link at our website if you'd like to donate that way. You know, if this church is going to keep growing, it's got to keep growing financially, and so you know that relies on everybody out there in the audience. So please donate generously. And finally, go in reason. We'll see you at Jason's. Next service is April 6th, 2008. We'll see you then. Thanks for coming.